Please.
Welcome to our virtual meeting. We're going to cover a few basic items before beginning. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. To members and city staff, members, if you are able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you are able, please activate your video when you are speaking. Use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak or ask questions. Staff, click raise hand when you are asked a question. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in the order in which hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak. The name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the commission, please send it to the email listed on today's agenda. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ariana. Aiden, if you could call a roll, please.
Sure thing. Juliana Bennett. MGR Govindarajan.
Here.
Nina Martinez Rutherford is excused tonight. Barbara Harrington McKinney.
Present.
Ann Kovich.
Here.
Robbie Weber.
Here.
Denise Jess. Let's see. Pepe Barros.
Here.
Darren Wozniewski.
Present.
Chris McHale.
Here.
Nikki Vandermeulen. We don't see Bill Bremer
Here.
and Harold Kleems.
He's excused.
Oh.
Yeah, he's traveling and unable to connect. I didn't hear from Denise, so let's see if she's over in. Oh, Reed Steitley is in attendees. He's a staff person. If you could move him over, please. Ariana, I don't see Denise over there. If you could maybe watch attendees for Denise in case she ends up over there.
Doesn't she come in as WBC or there's a different?
Yeah, Wisconsin Council for the Blind. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So she may show up. She may show up under. Yeah, she may show up under that. Okay, thanks. So Bill, you're able to vote this evening because we have several people gone. Did everybody have an opportunity to look at the minutes from the last meeting? Phil?
Make a motion for approval of the minutes from the last meeting.
Okay, there's a motion by Bill. Chris?
Second.
And a second by Chris. Any discussion? Okay, I'm going to assume a unanimous consent vote unless anybody, Darren?
Abstain.
Okay, so Darren is going to abstain. Okay, the motion is carried. And I do see an email from Denise saying her access technology just crashed, so she needs to do a computer restart. So we're all having issues like that. And she'll attempt to get back into the meeting so we can watch for her. Okay, item number 1. I understand, Aiden, we may have somebody registered to speak under 1.
We do. We have Todd Astroth of Harbor Town Drive Unit supports and wishes to speak on behalf of 30 other individuals who have signed the online petition for change for Junction Road.
Okay, Todd, go ahead. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have a presentation that I included. I don't know if anybody's able to see that. It's a Google Slides deck.
No, that has to be sent to staff if you wish to present something, but you do only have 3 minutes, so.
Okay, I'll try to run through it. I just wanted to propose that the stretch of Junction Road in West Madison between Mineral Point Road and Old Sauk Road be looked at. The pavement condition is sort of in a washboard type state, where there's like deeply sunken ruts and bumps every few feet. The other issue is that so I live at Junction Point condos, and we can hear when large tractor trailers go over the bumps. and sometimes it's loud enough to like cause vibrations in where I live, because they're going over the ruts. So I worked with, so I had a few people, 30 people sign a proposition where we'd like to have the city of Madison look into potentially either repaving Junction Road between Mineral Point Road and Old Sauk Road, as to be able to reduce the noise, or just repairing the deepest cracks just to cut down the truck noise, or adding a signal at the Prairie Town Center shopping plaza, and also designate a truck route that would direct trucks towards Mineral Point Road, instead of directing traffic. Perhaps trucks and traffic is trying to go past our place for easier access to the belt line. So that is generally what I was proposing. So I do have the slide deck, and if you, I guess if somebody can let me know where I should send that, I can be happy to send the link to that.
Okay, well, you could send that to the Transportation Commission email
Okay.
that's on the agenda. And Aiden will make sure that it gets distributed to all Transportation Commission members and to the appropriate staff, city staff who can consider that request as well.
All right, that should be it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming, Todd. Questions for Todd? Okay, I'm seeing no hands. Thanks, Todd. We'll watch for the presentation and take a look at it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Any disclosures and that was all we had tonight, other than, I believe there were some emails that at least one other email we got, right, Aiden?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so no other speakers?
That's correct.
Okay, any disclosures or recusals this evening? Okay, seeing no hands. We'll move on to item number 2, reminders regarding open meeting laws. And we've had some questions about this topic, and it's such an important topic. I asked Eric to spend just a few minutes reminding us of some of the very important things that we need to know about open meeting laws and some of the more lesser known reasons that we need to be concerned about it. So Eric, go ahead.
Thanks, Ann. So Wisconsin's open meetings laws are pretty important, and they
Can you
apply
speak
to
up just? I'm having a little trouble hearing you, Eric.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
I'll just speak up. Sorry, I have a dish or a laundry machine going behind me.
Okay, thanks.
So Wisconsin's open meetings laws are pretty important, and they apply to members of the city council as well as members of our boards, commissions, and committees, including Transportation Commission. These violations of this can be initiated by the attorney general, a district attorney, or individual citizens. So even if you think that we may have a favorable attorney general or district attorney that wouldn't prosecute this, an individual citizen can request that one of these goes forward. The penalty for violations is a forfeiture of at least $25 up to $300, plus statutory costs, which nearly double that. And the liability is personal. The city cannot reimburse for violations of the open meetings laws. And the other thing is that actions taken during any illegal meeting can be voided. So really quick, what this means is the rule of thumb is, if you've seen the movie Fight Club, rule number 1 about Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Well, the Transportation Commission is exactly the same. The first rule of Transportation Commission is you don't talk about Transportation Commission. And by that, I mean any substantive business that is foreseeably going to come before Transportation Commission, you should not be discussing with other commission members. And the way this works, there are 2 rules I want to highlight in particular, which is the walking quorum and a negative quorum. So the idea with these laws is that we don't want to have backroom, smoky cigar room deals. We want to have Wisconsin's business be done out and open in the public. So what that means is that the discussion should happen at Transportation Commission rather than having commission members decide things, amongst themselves beforehand. So this can be an email, this can be an in-person conversation, a letter, a phone call. Any of those things where you're substantively discussing these things can quickly be problematic. And the way it works is a majority of members meeting would be what's considered a quorum, so 6 members. But there's also what's called a negative quorum. That's enough people to defeat a potential action, to stop something from happening at Transportation Commission.
And
And
Eric, that
because-
can be as few as 3, correct?
Yeah, so there are 11 members on Transportation Commission plus 2 alternates, but that 11 number is important because a quorum is 6, which means that as long as there are 6 members, we can have a meeting. So
Mhm.
any 3 members could theoretically defeat an action. So that means you really can't talk about something with 2 other commission members. And so really, if you need to talk substantively with 1 other member about something, you could do that. But if that member's already talked to somebody else, then they may have to say, hey, I can't talk about this. The big exception to this rule, so I mean that I'll say that again. You can maybe talk with 1 other Transportation Commission member about something substantive or something you're thinking about, but other than that, you need to save it for Transportation Commission. The only exception is putting things on the agenda. So a discussion about whether something should be put on Transportation Commission's agenda or not. That's the exception, but it's limited to that. So for example, at the end of a meeting, we might discuss what's going to be on another meeting. The subject matter is not noticed, so we can't discuss the subject matter, but we can discuss when it should come before Transportation Commission. So I think that's about everything I had. The only other
Talk
bit I'll
about the
mention.
Can you talk about the walking quorum a little bit?
Yeah, so a walking quorum is, it would obviously be a violation if you got together 5 members of the commission to discuss something substantive. But if you had 4 individual conversations with members 1 at a time about something, those add up, right? So that's what's called a walking quorum. And the walking quorum and negative quorum concepts, right? Not enough members to be a majority, but enough to defeat an action. Those can be combined. So that's where a conversation with a member here and a conversation with a member there on the substantive merits, that would be 3 members. And now that would be a problematic walking negative quorum. I'm happy to answer any questions. There's also more information on the city attorney's website. I will mention that a couple of the slides on the attorney website are outdated and don't include information about some of the most recent ordinances, including that our meetings are recorded. But other than that, there's some great materials there. And you can feel free to reach out to me, eFinch at City of Madison, with any questions. Always happy to answer any commissioner's questions. I think that's about all I have. Tom?
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I might have been the one that prompted this reminder. And the reason why is for some reason, we're just getting a lot more open records requests. I think there's some areas of the city that are suspicious that things are happening, apart from the Transportation Commission. I don't feel like it's really a problem, but it's good to be reminded that we just talk about city business at a city meeting, and that's the best way to do it. So,
yeah. And as I'm looking at my notes here, there's one other part I didn't mention. Sometimes commission members may receive an email from me or from Ann that says, do not reply all. And that's exactly because of the open meetings laws. So sometimes an announcement needs to go out. Some information needs to be given to all the members. But then we don't want to have a conversation about how we're going to proceed over email. We want to save that for a meeting. Happy to take any other questions or.
Denise is in the attendees section. If you could please move her over, Ariana. Pepe, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Eric, for all the, reminders. In my case, as being, kind of one of the newer members, is more of a first time hearing everything in one place. So appreciate that. Quick question. How does it work when we touch base with staff, for example? Are there any rules regarding that?
So that's less of a concern, and that's actually a great way if you need to get some information about something that's before the commission. You can reach out to staff. You can get information. Basically, the concern is if people are making decisions together, or really doing things that should be done during a meeting together, right? So if you as an individual want to reach out to staff, you're always welcome to do that. I will note that information gathering can be considered a meeting activity, so you shouldn't gather information even as a group of more than two. But you can always feel free to reach out to me, reach out to staff in a relevant area if there's other information or clarification you need on something.
Yeah. I would just mention that the Transportation Commission handbook has summaries of these things that we're talking about tonight. And on the Transportation Commission website, under the training page, there are links to what Eric was talking about, to the city attorney's office for the training on open meetings laws. So if anybody needs, or if you're interested, we could have Aiden send out a link to the Transportation Commission website to everybody, just to remind everybody where it's located. But we tried to concentrate all the resources there so we could be reminded of all these things. So other comments or questions? I think, as Eric said, it's, we're committed, we're required under the law to have open discussion so that the public can hear what we're talking about. And what Eric is suggesting that we need, saying flat out, we need to avoid, is having those conversations with enough people to create a quorum, a negative quorum, a walking quorum, because it's held outside of public view, right, Eric? Because we're committed to having these discussions and making these decisions in public, right?
Yeah. The idea is that the public has a right to know how these decisions are made. And, I would reiterate, the city can't reimburse for liability on this. And it can void the action. So if you're really passionate about something, brush up your meeting notes and make a passionate argument at the meeting rather than, trying to contact members, individually outside of the meeting.
Yeah. And we're not saying that we think it's a big problem. It's just one of those reminders we should, it might even be something we should do once a year just because it's so important, right, Eric?
Yeah. I think there's a few other similar laws like this, so maybe we need to rotate them every, give a reminder on one or two of them every year. So
yeah. Okay. Other comments or questions? I see Alder Bennett's here, and Denise joined us. Other comments or questions for Eric? Okay. Thanks so much, Eric. Next we have Trent Schultz on review of the Transportation Demand Management Program. Go ahead, Trent.
Share my screen real quick here. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. So again, I am Trent Schultz, the Transportation Demand Management Coordinator here with the city, and I'm going to provide a year in review of the Transportation Demand Management TDM ordinance and program, and then also highlight some potential changes to the ordinance and the program as sort of the year in review. Take a step back just to refresh people about TDM. So the ordinance took effect last June, and it applies to new development, any sort of change of use. So going from a restaurant to retail, or an office space to a laboratory, and then also sites that are looking to increase parking. And the TDM ordinance reviews what sites will be doing to encourage non-single occupancy vehicle trips, and then also what they're going to be doing to invest in sustainable transportation amenities and infrastructure, whether that's a new B-cycle station or a bike maintenance facility or lockers and showers for cyclists. And that is reviewed through a TDM plan. And that's sort of what I review as a project is being proposed. And the overarching goal of TDM is to promote sites to have less parking and to also provide more transportation options, which, based on data analysis in other cities and sort of the best practices, can lead to lower vehicle miles traveled within cities. So within the year and change of the TDM ordinance taking effect, I have approved, and I'll correct this slide, 29 TDM plans, and there have been 20 other TDM plans come in but have not received approval, and about 5 of those are very soon going to be approved. And of the 29 TDM plans that I've approved, the average score or the points required for those is 15, and the points range from 0 to 37. So, really haven't seen many of the larger scale projects that have a ton of parking and are sort of a bigger footprint as well. There is a pretty good spread of the different types of sites that have been approved through the TDM ordinance. The most frequently occurring one is in the general urban area, and that is outside of the downtown core, but follows the high frequency transit routes, so A through D routes, not including any of their branches. But there have been other approved TDM plans outside of the high frequency transit, so in areas that might not have any transit access whatsoever, but they still have gotten an approved TDM plan. And so far, there's been a really good mix of the types of projects. So there have been more change of use sites, but still, I would say a pretty good sample size of the new construction and change of use, which I think have definitely led me to feel more comfortable about bringing some potential changes to you all today. And built into the ordinance is an up to 5 TDM point discretionary reduction that I have. And so far, 2 out of the 29 TDM plans that I've approved have gotten that point reduction. And the maximum point reduction in one of the cases, it was 3 TDM points, so it wasn't getting up to that 5 that is allowed. So in general, I think there's a lot that's going well with the ordinance. The first thing that I'll highlight is the location-based modifier, and that's shown in the map here. And what it is something that decreases the amount of TDM points required based on the location of the site under review. So downtown and the UW campus, any site there that is looking to redevelop or change its use would need to meet 100% of the TDM points. And then that's scaling back as you get further away from downtown to the peripheral area at 65% of TDM points. So that's south of the Beltline or east of the interstate. And additionally, I think there's a really good variety in the types of measures. So the TDM measures are what applicants would select to get to the amount of TDM points required for their project. And I think, there's a good balance between measures that are more geared towards residential development and then also ones that are geared towards commercial or employment uses, and then some that overlap between the two or other uses. And then I really think that the TDM plan review process is well integrated into the overall site plan review process. And so far, I really don't see that the TDM plan process has been really burdensome for applicants and development teams. So I think that was definitely one of the concerns leading up to the implementation of the ordinance, was how the TDM plan review would be integrated in to the site plan review process. And I think so far it's been very successful. Going back to the last time I was here in November of 2023, I just wanted to quickly highlight what was discussed and what was ultimately decided on for changes that were adopted by Common Council. So the first was to add uses that were permitted within the zoning code, but not explicitly called out or exempted within the TDM ordinance. So now that gap is filled. So uses that are permitted within the zoning code, but not exempted specifically within the TDM ordinance are subject to ordinance requirements. Second area was to improve sort of the wording around how to submit a TDM plan, when it's required, when an applicant would submit it in the overall site plan review process. That was pretty small potatoes change, but definitely made administering the ordinance much better and more improved. And then the last area is considering exemptions. The only proposed exemption last November was for wholly city-owned properties, and based on feedback not only at Plan Commission and TC, that did not go forward. But it is definitely something that for exemptions I will touch on later on in the presentation. So looking to the potential changes for this year, three main areas of focus. The first is TDM points. So going back to the TDM plans, TDM points are really what make or break a TDM plan and have people decide on what measures they're going to implement based on the amount of TDM points required. And then the second area is use exemptions. So different uses that don't need to provide any sort of TDM plan as they're going through the site plan approval process. And then lastly, new or revised TDM measures under consideration. So TDM points are shown here in this chart and are based on the scale of use and then also the amount of parking. So the scale of use really depends on what type of use category it falls under. So just looking at this table, for residential uses, that is dwelling units, and then for employment uses and other uses, that is based on square footage. And for residential uses, the TDM points are determined based on the ratio of parking stalls per dwelling unit. And then for employment uses, that TDM point value is based on the ratio of parking stalls per 500 square feet of floor area. And it's a little different for commercial and institutional uses. So that's banks or hospitals, those kinds of uses. And for those uses, the TDM points are determined based on the ratio of parking stalls to use-specific base parking. So that probably for some doesn't really mean much, but what that is effectively using the zoning code parking minimum. So it could be, as an example here, 1 stall per 2 employees for a clinic use, 10% of capacity for a health or sports club, and then 1 stall per 4 beds or based on a parking study or campus master plan. That's for hospital uses. So it's parking stalls divided by whatever it ends up being for 1 stall per 2 employees, just as an example. And with the differences between residential and employment uses compared to commercial and institutional uses, the way that the points are required has really led to a lot of confusion and really has been difficult to administer from my perspective, especially with a lot of parking minimums within the zoning code not really applying, since they don't exist within the transit-oriented development district, the central area. So that's bounded by Park Street and Blair. So anything in between there. And then also several zoning districts. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds of the zoning code, but there are some exceptions within those zoning districts. But in general, there are a lot of different properties within the city that don't have any sort of parking requirement. So in effect, currently, there could be a project where zoning staff will not need to enforce a parking minimum, but through TDM, I am in a way enforcing them and using those parking minimums. So it's definitely led to a lot of back and forth with applicants, and I would say just confusion on where to find the parking minimums, if they apply. And I definitely think there's better options out there to make the ordinance more user-friendly. Just to highlight some examples of sort of challenging parking minimums. So schools, whether public or private, the parking minimum is 1 space per classroom plus 1 space per 5 students of legal driving age based on the maximum number of students attending classes at any one time. Indoor recreation, so that's like a bowling alley or an axe throwing establishment, that is determined by the zoning administrator. So there could be a scenario where that isn't determined by the zoning administrator. So I think that on itself is really problematic for TDM purposes. And then there's other uses that have a specifically called out parking minimum of 0, such as a library use. So here's a table for the educational and institutional uses, how TDM points are determined. And as you can see, it's again based on the ratio of proposed parking to use-specific base parking. And as I highlighted before, it could be 1 stall per 2 employees or based on capacity. And then here's an example of an approved TDM plan where it's at 1709 Aberg Avenue for affordable dental care, right at the corner of Aberg and Sherman. It's an institutional use, so a clinic, and it's a relatively small tenant space, only slightly over 4,000 square feet. And previously it was an office use. So going from office to clinic is considered a change of use that brings the site into the TDM ordinance. And for clinic uses, the base parking, so what I was saying before, is 1 stall per 2 employees. And based on what the applicant team provided me as far as the expected number of employees and the number of parking stalls that were assigned to the tenant, that resulted in 20 TDM points being required for the project. And for this project in particular, one of those 2 projects that I mentioned before, as far as granting some point reduction, it did get awarded 2 points of relief. So it was something that needed to meet 18 TDM points instead of 20. Now, looking at a possible modification to institutional uses and specific to this project, instead of using 1 stall per 2 employees to set the foundation of how TDM points would be required, it could instead be more like employment uses where it's based on the same square footage for all uses. And so I just use as an example, parking stalls per 500 square feet of floor area. And that would actually result in a 5-point reduction in the TDM points required based on the way that the current tables are set up. I will mention that that could change and we could potentially recalibrate that. But just as an example, showing that, you know, it could lead to a slightly different outcome, but also could take into consideration smaller tenant spaces that are, you know, a change of use where they're not demolishing a building, constructing a new one, or constructing a huge addition. They're really not projects that are putting in a lot of money into a site. Not to say that they're, you know, not improving those sites. It's just that, you know, as far as comparing them to other projects, trying to think of the impact and what they're putting into the site, and having TDM introduced, it could lead to some issues for them as far as gaining approval for the project. I'll highlight again another example TDM plan specific to commercial uses, and I'll also note that the majority of the projects that I've approved that are commercial uses or reviewed have been within the small use category. So I definitely think there's an opportunity to potentially change how the tables are laid out to make sure that some of the, you know, realities of some of the realities of how you know, buildings are as far as square footage doesn't necessarily match this table, because I really haven't seen any projects with commercial uses that are greater than 40,000 square feet. So you know, I definitely think there's an opportunity to not only look at how points are determined, but also how they're formulated within the tables. So the commercial use example is for Planet Fitness, located at 229 West Town Mall, in between the new Von Maur and just north of the Dick's Sporting Goods. It's about a 37,000 square foot tenant space and was previously retail. So it was brought into the TDM ordinance by it being a change of use. And for a health club use, the base parking or parking minimum within the zoning code is 10% of capacity. And the estimated capacity that was provided to me by the architect on the project was 750 people. And based on the amount of parking stalls assigned to the tenant, 11 TDM points were required. And I will say that this is another sort of problematic parking minimum in that capacity is really determined at the point of a building plan review, which happens after site plan. So I'm really getting an estimate of capacity, not a formal, this is what the capacity was determined by the building plan reviewer on city staff. So I've had several projects coming in that their parking minimum was based on capacity. I reached out to building plan review staff. They gave me an estimate, but also said, hey, I need to look at a formal plan, but one hadn't been submitted at that time. So I think moving away from capacity would really lead to less staff time and communication on back and forth and trying to figure out what the capacity is, but also just a more streamlined process for determining TDM points on the applicant side. And looking at what that could look like as far as not having capacity, if it was instead like employment uses at 500 square feet of floor area for that base parking, that would actually result in the same amount of TDM points required. So I think based on these two projects and analysis of other projects and how they would be impacted if those base parking numbers were more uniform, it could lead to more desired outcomes and really wouldn't, unless it's tailored in a certain way, lead to a lot of difference in how TDM points are scored and determined. So as far as addressing the problem with how TDM points are determined, I think there are two options. The first could be to change the base parking requirements on a use-by-use basis. And I am saying base parking requirements and not zoning code parking minimums because I'm not within zoning and don't want to suggest any changes there. But as far as base parking is concerned, it could be on a use-by-use basis where, for example, looking back to indoor recreation, where the parking minimum or base parking is determined by the zoning administrator, that could instead, just as an example, be one stall per 400 square feet of floor area. Now, with this option, it would not be consistent through use categories, and it would sort of be an ad hoc, let's change this use, let's change that use, but maintain other ones. And so the other option could be to modify entire use categories to use a consistent scoring method, like residential and employment uses. So just looking back to some of those other projects that I highlighted, instead of the TDM points being determined based on the base parking requirements of one stall per 2 employees or 10% of capacity, it would instead, for all of those commercial uses or all of those commercial or all those institutional uses as well, just be one stall per 500 square feet of floor area. And I think that could lead to more uniformity throughout the ordinance and, really make it so, it's more predictable. And I also think it provides an opportunity to consider how the TDM ordinance impacts smaller projects like the one on the corner of Aberg and Sherman, and then also larger projects, speaking to what I was saying before as far as some of the tables really don't match up with the realities of the scale of development. So moving on to use exemptions, there are currently 2 different use categories that have exemptions. So commercial includes daycare centers, nursery schools, and animal daycare facilities as exempted uses. And then institutional includes K-8 schools, both public and private, institutions with campus master plans, so that includes UW-Madison and I believe Edgewood College, and then also places of worship and public safety facilities. So in considering any changes to use exemptions, I think there are 3 key areas to take into account. So the first is the impact of removing those exemptions. If by removing those exemptions, uses would be overburdened and really don't necessarily fit in well with TDM considerations, I think that could be something taken into account. And then also peer TDM ordinances, what other cities are doing. And then lastly, how any change would apply to the code and some of the nuances that would come with that. So looking at impact, I believe removing exemptions would definitely increase the number of projects subject to TDM. There have been quite a few projects that were assigned to me for review that I looked at and saw what the use was and determined, oh, well, here in the code it says that X use is exempt, so it didn't need to submit a TDM plan as part of the site plan review. And then I also think it could improve ordinance consistency. So looking at a specific example of animal daycare and boarding, animal boarding facilities need to comply with the TDM ordinance, but animal daycare facilities are explicitly exempt. And I remember one project in particular where it was an animal daycare facility that also had animal boarding. So I think there's a little bit of a gray area there, and we could definitely have something that is more predictable for an applicant coming in where, it's not difficult to discern whether they're animal boarding or animal daycare, especially with those being different as far as whether they're exempt or not. And speaking to other cities, what they do, that other cities that have TDM ordinances, the majority of them do not have use-specific exemptions. Some cities do have exemptions based on Berkeley, California, as an example, for affordable units. Those wouldn't need to be subject to their TDM ordinance. And then also St. Paul, Minnesota, as an example, doesn't have some smaller scale projects, so under 20 dwelling units, as something that needs to comply with their ordinance. I will say that within the City of Madison TDM ordinance, there are measures specific to different levels of housing affordability. So it really depends on the amount of units that are considered affordable and also what type of or what level of subsidy they are. So the more units, the higher subsidy, the more TDM points. And then for that scale consideration, we definitely have those built in to a lot of different uses where the smaller scale projects that don't have a lot of parking don't necessarily need to meet and comply with the TDM ordinance. So going back to last year, and as far as considering the wholly city-owned exemption, I wanted to bring back the current exemption of public safety and service facilities, which is defined within the zoning code as a government facility for public safety, service, and emergency services, including a facility that provides police or fire protection and public-related services. So at this point, I'm not suggesting any specific changes to the use exemptions. It's more just posing questions just related to the previous discussion about wholly city-owned exemptions and how TDM should apply to public uses. And then also, should there be some carve-outs to say, certain public-related uses could be specifically exempted. And I will also note that currently, with just the public safety or service facility exemption, there are other city projects that might not meet the definition of a public safety or service facility that still need to comply with the TDM ordinance. And one of those in particular is the men's shelter that's nearing shovels in the ground right off of Stoughton Road. And they needed to comply with TDM. They did it, and they provided almost double the amount of points that were required through the ordinance. They're going to be constructing an off-street path for bicyclists and people walking and rolling, and then also a B-cycle station and a bike maintenance station. So, it's an example of a city-owned project that didn't meet the public safety or service facility use, but clearly showed that it can be done and it can far exceed the TDM points required and isn't necessarily burdensome to meet that TDM point value requirement. I also think going past public safety and service facilities, any changes to some of those use exemptions, I think it's important to consider the next steps of if those exemptions are removed, how TDM points would be determined for those uses. So looking specifically at places of worship, which are currently exempted from the TDM ordinance, the base parking or parking minimum within the zoning code is currently 1 stall per 10 seats or 15 lineal feet of seating area in the main worship space. And if there's no fixed seats, it would be 1 stall per 70 square feet of floor area in the main worship space. And that is probably the longest parking requirement I've ever read. So I just, am highlighting that to show that I think, it could definitely be something that the use exemptions could be removed or modified, but thinking of the next steps is definitely important. So moving on to TDM measures and any changes to them, there are 9 areas of different measures. So the first is active transportation. The second is transit related. Then moving on to parking management, shared mobility, information and communication, delivery, land use, employer policies, and other measures. As I mentioned before, I think one of the strong suits of the TDM ordinance is the variety in measures. Now, with that being said, I definitely think there are some changes to take into account and really leaning on feedback from applicants and city staff who, might have different programs that they're trying to implement, taking that into account and making those changes. So specific to Metro with the fare technology and pass option changes that are coming along with BRT, I think it'll be important to ensure that the TDM program and the different measures that are transit related really are in alignment with the new fare technology options with, I'd say, just more flexibility in the different types of passes that will be offered shortly. And then also I've heard from Metro Transit staff about a recommendation for a new measure that would allow points for buildings that provide access to Metro drivers, whether they're on a break or a shift change. I've heard that that's definitely an issue for drivers. So that could be a new measure that's added. And then also based on feedback from applicants, I think there's a lot of different measures that could improve on their clarity, just to make sure that, say, if you're reviewing a TDM plan and the different measures for the first time, you have a good sense of what those measures actually are. So, one example is unbundling parking. Within the TDM measure description right now, it's not really clear whether that applies to all the parking stalls or only structured parking stalls, as an example. And based on my review of when the TDM ordinance was being introduced and going through the approval process, it was meant to be sort of an all or nothing thing where either you're charging for all of your parking or not. And that was the only way to qualify for that measure. As it's a 10-point measure, the highest point value measure within the ordinance. And then also just to clarify, measures that might have some overlap or seem like they're saying the same thing. So looking back at delivery related measures, so the delivery supportive amenities, that's a 1-point measure that is something that a business or an apartment building would provide a secured location for mail providers to drop off packages. So it's not just a bunch of boxes piling up on the outside of the front door. But then there's also a package drop off area measure, which is a 2-point measure, and it has nothing related to delivery drivers dropping stuff off. It's actually for customers or other, people going to a business that are able to drop off a package for acceptance by FedEx or whatever it might be, whatever vendor it might be. So I think based on those two measures, there's been a lot of confusion that has been, elaborated to me. So I definitely think there's an opportunity to change that to make it more clear for applicants.
Mhm.
As far as the timeline and next steps, I will hopefully be meeting with Metro Transit staff and city engineering staff soon. With Metro Transit, I want to have a better sense of how the fair technology updates are going, and if any changes to TDM measures should be made to make sure that the TDM measures align with the past options that will be offered soon. And then also with city engineering, since they are the project manager for the majority of city-led projects, specific to the public safety exemption, how to really make sure that we're all on the same page about different projects that would or could apply and fit within that public safety use. And then moving on to a RESG analysis, that is definitely something that we want to do as part of any policy changes or any ordinance changes to TDM. It would be led by the parking and traffic engineering equity team. So I will make sure that that's a part of any changes to the ordinance and program. Would also look to take additional feedback from people who have received TDM plan approvals. And as far as the timing is concerned, I'd hope to aim for early September to introduce the changes to Common Council. And then that would mean coming back to TC in mid-October, and would likely require going to Plan Commission at a separate meeting. And then that would put this on track for the formal Common Council review in late October, which is just before budget season. So fingers crossed on that timeline, but that's all I have. So I'll open up to any questions you all might have.
So before we get to questions, I know we got some emails in from people on this topic. Do we have anybody registered to speak?
We do not, no.
Anybody registered at all?
Nope, just one person for item 1.
Okay, thank you. So comments or questions for Trent? I think he's looking for feedback as he's developing the draft changes to bring back to us. It'd be helpful for him to hear from us as to how we feel about the things that he's described. And I'm all for clarifying and simplifying so that it's more user-friendly, but still certainly maintains the goals of TDM. Thoughts, questions? Pepe.
Yeah, I guess I can get started. First, thank you, Trent, for the presentation. I think it was pretty clear, very complete. Just a quick clarification question, and pretty basic question, just to make sure that I'm understanding the program well, because I haven't been exposed to it very much. So what I understand is that for example, based on, let's say, square footage or employee count, they get a certain level of points each project, and then based on those points, they have to provide mitigation solutions that would add up to those points that the ordinance is requiring, right?
Yep, that's correct. So, if a site has 30 dwelling units and a ratio of dwelling units to parking stalls of over 2, they would need to provide a lot of different TDM measures as far as implementing them. So that's, having a secure bike storage room, or providing like real-time bus tracker information near an exit. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on the scale of the project, but it is something that, people need to select TDM measures based on the scale of the project and what TDM points are required.
Is it now for the excess over certain requirement of parking stalls, or is it for the total amount of parking stalls?
It's the total.
The total.
That's in the calculation.
Mhm.
You know, if it's in excess of the current parking minimums or base parking, that would lead to a higher score. But for the calculation itself to determine TDM points, that's just based on the total number of parking stalls on the site.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I personally like the recommendations that you're doing for the things that, you know, can get complex, and when you see those two differences, for example, in the example that you were showing of, like, you know, depending how you measure, that I think it was a dentist clinic, if I remember well, and Aberg, you know, that would be really good to offer some clarification, so we're making clear what's the actual policy instead of creating, you know, so many gray areas. So updating that, I think, is a moving in the right direction. This, I don't know if this is even subject to discussion right now, but personally, I think that public use should not necessarily be exempted from TDM. I mean, my view is that the city as a whole should always be ahead of the curve and set an example for private projects. So I really like the example that you shared of you know, some public projects that were actually taking the lead and addressing you know, the points that they were technically getting. So that would be my view regarding those exemptions that you were talking about. Of course, we can maybe go deeper into the weeds when it's the case for specific safety and service. But I mean, as a general rule, I would think that even including safety, public use, we should, you know, the whole city should be held to the same standard as a way to push for, you know, a more progressive policy across the board, and set the example for private projects.
Is that all you had then, Pepe?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Darren, go ahead.
Trent, yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question is with respect to exemptions. I might have missed it, but I didn't get a clear understanding of, like, what area are you heading when you had highlighted some of the pure TDM policies, particularly, like, you know, maybe the St. Paul approach. I know that the other one you had talked about, there already is something for affordability calculator in there. But the just, you know, going like the St. Paul approach for smaller projects.
Trent, you're muted, I believe.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Trent.
Sorry about that. So any project currently within the city that's under 10 dwelling units, as far as a residential project, wouldn't need to be subject to the TDM ordinance. So I do think we have some of those built in, and there's other examples of, you know, commercial uses that don't need to meet TDM if they're under a certain ratio. So it's 1.25. For those smaller scale projects under 40,000 square feet, those don't need to be subject currently to the TDM ordinance. So I do think we have some scale exemptions built in, which I would say is on par with some other peer cities.
Great, thank you for clarifying.
Thanks, Darren. Robbie, go ahead. You're muted, Robbie.
Sorry, I was having a little trouble with my computer. It's been acting up a
Sure.
little.
It's going around. It's going around tonight.
Yeah. I was just going to mention that since a lot of this is based on the amount of parking that the development builds, and we the Plan Commission meeting on curb management that we were all invited to mentioned that a lot of areas of the city do not have minimum parking requirements. You know, a lot of the sort of requirements for parking that you were stating wouldn't apply to all areas of the city. Maybe you can just refresh us on where minimum parking requirements actually do exist and where they do not. And then if there is no minimum parking and they choose to build parking or they choose not to build parking, how that affects their TDM points that are required. So I guess just the relationship between the minimum parking requirements and the TDM.
So within the central area, there are no parking requirements, minimum parking requirements, and within the transit-oriented development overlay district, so that follows a quarter mile of high-frequency transit outside of the downtown core. That also doesn't have any parking minimum. And then I'd say around 10 or so zoning districts don't have any parking requirements. There are some exceptions to that that are based on the building size. So as an example, within the neighborhood mixed use zoning district, buildings greater than 10,000 square feet do have parking minimums based on the use. And then there's others such as traditional shopping street, which I would say is like Monroe Street or, and I'm just shooting from the hip here, but Monroe Street or Willie Street, restaurants, taverns, those kind of uses. If they're within 300 feet of the site in question, those properties would also need to provide a minimum parking requirement or adhere to the minimum parking requirement. I'm trying to think of the second part of your question, so maybe tie back into that. I don't know if you.
So some of your examples, you gave examples of what they were required to build for parking, but that there are a lot of areas where they're not actually required to build parking. And how does what they choose to build for parking affect then what they are required to, how many points they're required to get for the TDM? So just the interplay of the choices on how much parking they build versus the points they are required to get for the TDM.
So in instances where there's no parking requirement and they provide a certain level of parking, that would, for TDM purposes, tie back into what the general use specific parking requirement would be. And that's more for those commercial and institutional uses. But for a residential use, as an example, if that's in the TOD overlay, the TDM points are determined based on the ratio between the parking provided and the number of units. So it really depends on the use in particular, how that's determined. But I think I sort of touched on it earlier where, there are a lot of cases where there's no parking requirement, no minimum parking requirement through the zoning code that's enforced, whether that be in the central area or within the TOD overlay, that zoning is saying you don't need to provide any sort of parking. But in a way, the TDM ordinance is using the zoning code parking minimum, not to suggest that there should be some parking, but it seems like it creates a lot of confusion when there's sites that don't have any zoning enforced parking minimum, but then the way that TDM works is there's a parking minimum. So I think it's just really over confusing.
I'm sorry, the med flight is going over my house, so I hope it's not making too much noise. So even if they are not required to build parking, then you still have to use some theoretical level of parking to determine how many TDM points they need to get, even if they're not building that parking that is, I mean, that's where I'm sort of confused, because if they're near a bus line and they say, well, we don't need to build parking, and so we're not going to build parking, why are they then required to have that higher level of points? That was my question, I think.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of an example that might help to answer your question. So let's say that there's a mixed use project within a quarter mile of high frequency transit. There's 50 apartments and then first floor commercial. The residential, if there's no parking or very low parking, they would still need to provide a certain level of TDM points. Anything greater than 25 dwelling units is subject, regardless of how much parking there is, to provide a certain level of TDM points. So a sub example to my example, there was a project that was recently at DAT, Development Assistance Team, where they had, I think, over 300 units and no parking stalls. That still needed to provide, or would need to provide, around 12 TDM points. So it is a little convoluted in that way. But sorry, getting back to my other example, with mixed use development, 50 apartments, and then some level of commercial space and some level of parking. The parking counts would be looking at the residential units, whether those parking stalls are tied to the apartments, and then what parking stalls are tied to the commercial units. And from what I've seen, the majority of the mixed use buildings that are, through the site plan review process, the commercial space is really below the level of anything that's subject to the TDM ordinance, because if there's very little parking dedicated to those commercial uses and it's under 40,000 square feet, they don't need a TDM plan.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm still confused, but that's okay.
I think I think it is confusing. And Trent, I think what you're trying to accomplish is to make it less confusing. So I think what these questions are really emphasizing that you're headed in the right direction by trying to make it less confusing. Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. I have a couple questions about exemptions, but maybe I can help clarify, since it took me a while to figure this out too. Trent, correct me if I'm wrong. If you wanted to build an indoor recreation facility downtown, you would not be required to provide parking, but you would need to go get the zoning administrator's opinion on how much parking is required, just so that they could do TDM.
That's correct. And that was a perfect example. I should have thought of that. Man.
You used that one.
But in the terms that you used, yeah, I mean, I think that example highlights a key issue with these uses that have the base parking requirements within the TDM program that are based on the zoning code parking minimums, and with discussions on removing parking minimums entirely or modifying them, while also considering the current areas of the city that don't have any parking minimums. I think it really highlights a key issue with the current way that the TDM ordinance is set up. I will mention that something that I am hoping to bring at a future future TC meeting is an analysis of how many parcels within the city don't have any parking requirements. I think that would really help to inform any decision on TDM specifically, and what could be done to change that, I would say, discrepancy between a project that doesn't have any parking minimums but has an unworkable parking minimum or base parking requirement through the TDM ordinance, like the bowling alley downtown.
Thanks. Hopefully we're getting there. My question
Yeah.
actually is about, so we had some public comment, like concerns about implementing TDM on a daycare facility, for example. Since you've gone through some of these projects now, could you sort of characterize, in that case, like how onerous would that be for a facility of that type, right? It's not like they can't have parking. They can build essentially as much parking as they want, but the more parking they provide, they have to pile on some stuff and some mitigation points, and how difficult you think that would be in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different factors. So, I mean, the first one would be whether it's a change of use or a new building. Within a change of use, I think if a daycare is trying to come into an existing tenant space with, a situation where maybe it's overparked, that would mean that they would need to provide a lot more TDM measures. And then comparing that to a new build, they, can really, through working with TDM and, zoning and just the site plan review process, ensure that it wouldn't be overburdensome. So I really think it depends on the type of project. I would also highlight that there are, a lot of different ways that people are going to get to daycare. And not only that, but there are employees that if there's a daycare center that's on a transit line, but no bus pad or, no real-time tracker or other amenities outside of transit, I really think that just makes it more difficult for more people to use the daycare services. And more parking doesn't necessarily mean more access.
Thanks. And then I wanted to clarify on the library scenario, because libraries are currently not exempted, but since they have no minimum parking requirement, they have no TDM requirement. So essentially, we've said we're not going to require libraries to build parking for whatever reasons, but that means that they get to build as much parking as they want and not have to do any TDM. Is that sort of the situation?
So I haven't gotten an official interpretation on that. There's one project, the Imagination Center, at Rindell Park, that they're proposing a library and a community center. And for that, at least preliminarily, I used, instead of that 0 parking minimum, a 1 stall per 400 square feet of floor area parking minimum, or base parking, just to make that work. That project hasn't been approved, but I think that's sort of a patchwork way to address the 0 parking minimum and how that's really unworkable. And the 1 stall per 400 square feet of floor area is a parking minimum that's used for a whole host of uses, including office space. And I'd have to look at the zoning code parking table, but there are a lot of different uses that use that, and it's not really an overburdensome parking requirement. But yeah, I mean, libraries, indoor recreation, there's so many uses that have parking minimums that really make it cumbersome, not only from the applicant side to determine that, but also my side in reviewing these different projects to determine the amount of TDM points required.
Thanks. That's good for
Okay,
now.
thanks, Chris. Denise, go ahead.
You're now unmuted. Unmute. Great, thank you. I'm still really wrapping my mind around this, trying to make sure I'm understanding it. So, how does kind of the net worth of the business factor in? Because I'm thinking of something like a daycare where they may be trying to really keep their costs as low for affordability for families, and money is really tight and resources are tight, and staffing is tight compared to a business that has a lot more, they're making a lot more money. So I don't quite understand how the the net income of the business also, does that factor in? Is that irrelevant in looking at this? Just trying to think about, the burden that might be there for some businesses over others.
So I would say that is not really taken into account currently within the ordinance. For uses that are subject to the TDM plans, it definitely can be something that is, I suppose, addressed in other ways. So I mentioned sort of the smaller projects and the larger projects that. At least from what I've experienced, there have been a few of the smaller projects that I would say were overburdened by TDM, and could definitely be, modified. The ordinance could be modified in a way that takes that into account and doesn't try to, push a high TDM score and really makes it a situation where they're scraping for this TDM measure and that TDM measure, and then they're project is out of money. I don't think that the ordinance should function in that way, and I do think that there's opportunities to change the way that the ordinance, as far as how points are determined, looks at those smaller projects that don't necessarily have the capital available to implement, a huge TDM related measure that costs thousands of dollars or whatever it might be.
I would just add that, as you do the ResJ analysis, that's the kind of conversation that could be incorporated as part of the conversation with regard to that. And also, Trent, you have some flexibility with point reductions that you can offer, like you did with the Affordable Dental Care project, right?
Yes, and I would say that I've approached that reduction as sort of a last resort, especially with it being a new ordinance. I really don't want to set a precedent for projects that, are unfamiliar with TDM to not really engage with the idea of what TDM represents and what it actually looks like. But in the two instances where I did approve that reduction, it seemed to make the most sense because they, in each instance, really gave it a good effort to look through like what measures make sense, what can we implement with some of the constraints that are built in. So I think there's opportunities for, that reduction built into the ordinance, and really could address some of the equity concerns in addition to any changes that are made to some of those smaller scale projects, and not maybe trying to have as high a point values as there are currently for sites that might be change of use where it's currently overparked and the tenant can't control that.
Right. Yeah. Okay, other comments or questions? And last time we had a spirited discussion about public uses and agreed that we didn't think that they should be exempted. So we did not endorse that change last time around. Any additional thoughts or more current thoughts with regard to that? Pepe already said he didn't think that public uses should be exempted and we should set the TDM standard for those public uses, noting that great example that you gave about a city project where they're overachieving on TDM, which is awesome. Other thoughts in that regard? Any other comments for Trent? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree that public uses should not be exempted for all the reasons we discussed before. So just for the sake of a couple of feedback points, I like that you're thinking about new measures like the bathrooms for Metro. I think those are good ideas. I'm kind of curious if you've thought through how something like that would work, where basically some sort of business would be required to let bus drivers in because of this ordinance that lives in a completely different department, and then you've got like Metro complaining that the drivers can't get in and they have to somehow figure out why it was that they were supposed to be allowed in the first place, that the sort of logistics?
Yeah, I definitely want to get a better sense of what Metro expects for that and work with them to make sure that the language makes sense. And I've worked a little bit with Eric to get something sort of ready, but I really don't want to go much further without meeting with Metro to make sure that I understand fully like what their idea would be for how that ordinance would function. And I would say that, TDM plans are not necessarily going to address that in many instances. It's, I think a larger problem that isn't solely going to be addressed by the TDM plans that are coming through, but is definitely an option that I don't see why not having it in there as something that could encourage that if, people are looking to get points and are struggling to get there, having that as an option would be really helpful for not only Metro staff, but applicants that are looking to get TDM points.
Eric, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I can just add one thing. We've looked at the ideas, Trent and I have had some discussion about this. There's different thoughts on how we would try to get a business to be useful for our drivers. So the reality is we have buses that run pretty early in the morning and pretty late into the night. So it might be that there's one level of points available for a certain number of hours, and then a more complete number of hours would allow a wider ability. I think then there would be a question of if they're going to go after those longer hours, then there's issues like how are we going to do building access, and there it's just a can of worms that we can get into. But I think the sort of ideal working thought is maybe there's some points for having it daytime. I think with a lot of office buildings and new buildings that are near bus routes where this would be useful, that would be what we would aim for. And then we also wouldn't want to just offer those points to anybody anywhere, because there are properties and projects that are not along bus routes that they would just be getting free points and never doing anything. So we would want to avoid that as well. And that's all I had on that.
One last quick thing then. Just to your question about unbundling parking, yes, I think the intention is it's all or nothing, regardless of what type of parking that is. I guess I would be curious to know if when you come back to us before October, if you wanted to consider whether it made sense to offer partial points for partial unbundling or something like that. But otherwise, this is all looking like some great changes. So thanks.
Yeah, I would say that I would definitely consider a sort of half unbundling where, maybe a site that isn't downtown but has underground parking and then a surface parking lot. If, they have a few stalls that are at the surface lot and are more geared towards guests, but then the stalls that are underground and structured parking, that those are decoupled from rent and charged. I could see that being worth points. But since it's 10 points right now, I really don't want it to be something that is too high of a value, because I do think that really misses the whole intent of unbundling parking, but still could allow for some flexibility for projects that have a certain level of surface parking. And there have been projects that have tried to get the unbundling parking measure, and then I was asking them, are you charging for the surface stalls? And they said no, and then I was like, well, this isn't going to qualify for the unbundling parking measure. So I think in those instances, it would definitely allow for a little bit more flexibility in those projects to get more TDM points and still be in line with the intent of the general measure.
That all you had then, Chris? Yeah? Okay. Alder Harrington McKinney, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Trent, thank you so very much for the presentation, and I'm still trying to unpack all this. And I want to circle around where you had the RESJ analysis. And so could you give me an idea of what that would look like, what you're looking for, and how that would be framed? I hope that that's a good question.
Yeah, I think some of the main things we would look at, kind of addressing what Denise brought up earlier, and also making sure that the smaller scale projects that for the most part don't have the resources available that a project that's demolishing a building and constructing a new one might have. I feel like those types of projects and those development teams are more burdened by the TDM ordinance, and looking into through the residue analysis whether there's a way to take that into account and potentially change the way that the ordinance is administered for those types of projects and those types of situations. And it could also be something that we bring in people who have submitted TDM applications before and have had issues with just some of the constraints inherent in their business. I know I mentioned the Affordable Dental Care Clinic. Microphone cut out there. The Affordable Dental Care Clinic had some issues, but they also, through their TDM plan, are providing bus passes to all their employees. So I don't think it's something that would necessarily be a scenario where TDM wouldn't apply to those smaller scale projects, but making sure that it's really taking into account the differences between those types of projects that are smaller scale and don't necessarily have all the resources that are inherent in demolition, rebuild, and all that comes along with that.
Okay, thank you very much. And it sounded as though that you would be seeking out those individuals who would have experiences in that area for your input. Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. I'm complete.
Okay, thanks, Alder. Denise, go ahead.
Audio now unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. Trent, this might be completely off the wall, but thinking about, some of the mitigation or the ways to, help with points, so often I hear my friends and colleagues who use accessible vehicles or have disability tags really struggle, particularly downtown, to find parking, accessible parking. And is there a way to kind of think about increasing the accessible parking through TDM? So, there's the minimum mandate, of course, that places have to have for accessible stalls, but we don't have a lot of street, just kind of trying to creatively think about how we could be increasing that accessible parking and also support folks in doing some, TDM point mitigation.
Yeah, I definitely think that could be a great option for a new measure going above and beyond the ADA mandated accessible parking stall counts, and could be something that really helps to get more access to people that need an accessible stall. That I don't know when the last time that those ADA requirements were put into place, but knowing that there are a lot of issues with access and the number of parking ramps and just private development that don't have that would definitely be something that could be added to the measures and would really have a big impact for accessibility.
Yeah, excellent. Other comments or suggestions for Trent? Okay, it's a complicated program, no question about it. So we appreciate the review to help remind us of some of that, and great feedback from people with regard to some from Trent to start with, and from other members with regard to ways that we could try and enhance and or improve the program. So other comments for Trent? And if you do think of something offline, since Trent is staff, feel free to send him an email and get him that additional feedback, right, Trent?
Yeah, and I will say that, with this needing to be introduced to council, we would look for a sponsor. And so I don't necessarily think that's something that, needs to be decided on now, but it's definitely something under consideration. And I think it would be really beneficial for it to be someone on TC, or it could be someone else, but obviously that's a part of this process if any changes are going to occur.
Yeah, so feel free to reach out to the alders on TC. So, great. Other comments or questions? All right, we'll look forward to hearing from you in the near future with regard to this. So, thanks so much, Trent. Okay, next we have Reed with the Badger Rusk Path.
Good evening, everyone. Here, let me share my screen here. All right. Can you see that, the map here?
Yes.
Great. All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Tonight, this is Reed Steitley with City Madison Streets and Paths Engineering. I'm the PM for this project, the Badger Rusk Shared Use Path. I'm here tonight for your review and feedback on the proposed improvements for this project. Brief overview here. So this is first of all, this map is oriented facing north here. We are on West Badger Road and North Rusk Avenue between this pedestrian overpass bridge that crosses the Beltline up to Nygaard Street. It's approximately 0.4 miles long here. This project is receiving federal funding through the Transportation Alternatives Program, and it's being facilitated by WSDOT as well. The thrust of the project, I guess, is to fill this approximately 0.4 mile gap in our pedestrian and bike path system, and ultimately to allow for better connections for folks in neighborhoods on both the north and the south sides of the Beltline. So with this project, which is a reconstruction project, we're looking to partially reconstruct West Badger Road, starting on the east side of this existing bridge, and essentially at the pedestrian overpass bridge here, which is a bike and ped overpass bridge, and install a 10-foot wide grade separated shared use path along the north side of West Badger Road, running east to North Rusk Avenue, where the path would continue up north, following along the west side of North Rusk Avenue up to Nygaard Street, continuing north. Then the path is on street on North Rusk Avenue. The project would essentially partially realign this north curb and gutter on West Badger Road to be able to fit this path in on the north side of the road here, and effectively would be maintaining both of the existing lanes of traffic going east and westbound, but reduce the width of the roadway, essentially utilizing 11-foot lanes with type A curb and gutter, so 2-foot pan for that on both sides, so a 26-foot face-to-face cross section on West Badger Road. Then continuing again to the east, where we tie into North Rusk Avenue. North Rusk Avenue is currently unimproved in that it doesn't have curb and gutter on either side of the street, and there is no existing sidewalk on this stretch of North Rusk between West Badger and Nygaard Street. So this would be more of a full reconstruct of the street here that we're proposing, including curb and gutter on both sides of the street and sidewalk on the east side of the street that would kind of fill this gap between this existing sidewalk north of Nygaard Street to the sidewalk continuing east on Badger. So with this, with these improvements, then essentially the cross section of the street width would essentially remain the same. The width out here unimproved is about 32 feet. And so we would try to maintain that. There also is parking along the east side of the street, or I'm sorry, excuse me, along the west side of Northwest Avenue. And we would maintain that as well with the project. Currently, there's no parking allowed on West Badger Road. So essentially maintaining the same street setup that is existing right now on Northwest, except with curb and gutter, the new path on the west side, and additional sidewalk to fill the gap on the east side. Along with these street improvements, we would also look to upgrade utilities as needed with the project. So including storm is the main proponent here. By changing the alignment of the curb and gutter, we will need to adjust inlets, and that would to make sure that everything is draining properly, and the water and sanitary sewer on North Rusk. There is none on West Badger. That is the water and sanitary sewer that's on North Rusk is actually in great condition. So that's going to be more or less replaced as needed, but we're not really anticipating many utility impacts for those public utilities on North Rusk. The majority of the work would be storm sewer work for this section here to make sure everything ties in correctly. Additionally, for some additional safety benefits and to be again consistent with, sorry, I shouldn't say again, this addition of the path was consistent with the South Madison plan, Vision Zero and Complete Green Streets. So this is another thrust for the project to install per the approved South Madison plan. We'd also be looking to install some rapid flashing beacons, or RFBs, at the crossing here, where the existing pedestrian overpass bridge meets West Badger Road, as well as install new pedestrian or ADA approved curb ramps and curb openings. And then eventually, and this project is being planned for construction in 2025. We don't have anything on the docket yet, but eventually the idea would be to continue the path going east on East Rusk Avenue up to Rimrock. So kind of setting this up then for future improvements when that time comes. Essentially, that is the project here. Again, it's being the path project, the bike path, and some of the tie-in with the road is what's being federally funded. The remainder of the project will be funded to the city and with our assessment policy. So I think that's in general the idea of the project. I guess just to confirm, I don't know if I said this, but on North Rusk, we would have kind of this similar cross section. That's what it is. So it'd be 32 feet face to face, the 10-foot path on the west side, and a 5-foot sidewalk on the east side. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're looking at for this one. In general, just kind of looking for any feedback and opinions on the work being done here from the commission.
Renee, did you have anything to add before we go to questions?
No, just that, like Reed said, this is kind of a project that will be phased in over time. So the next section will be the section to the east to connect to a path that Dane County is planning on Rimrock Road that would then connect you into the Cap City path. But we are already kind of talking about how to go west as well to make that connection in a kind of 3-phase approach.
Yeah, you're in my neighborhood with this. Comments or questions for Reed, Renee? I see Yang's here as well. Welcome back, Yang. Comments or questions? Anybody have any comments or questions? Pepe, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Reed, for the presentation. Very excited about this project as it is also nearby my the neighborhood that I live in. So, well awaited connection, and again, super cool idea on how to start connecting the south side and all the benefits, all the network for the south side of Madison. So happy for that. I have a couple of questions. One is just to confirm, would this shared path, so when we talk about shared path, of course, we're expecting this is not a path for just bicyclists. Of course, it's for all modes of, transportation in terms of walking, rolling, etc. Related to that, will this shared path, is it planned to be at curb level, or is it on street level?
Sure, great question. So yes, the 10-foot multi-use or shared use path is grade separated, so it will be essentially 5 feet, at least what we're planning right now, away from the curb. So it'll be up and separated from the street. So it's up and away, grade separated. And yep, it'll be designed with all users' ages and abilities in mind here. So adhering to our design guidelines for steepness and width and offsets, so forth, for that.
Please go ahead.
I guess just one, I don't know if I hit it in the presentation. So on West Badger Road, there's some existing sidewalk that is there. The path kind of overlaps with where that is right now. It'll be wider. Obviously, it's kind of right now kind of tapping into where the back of the sidewalk is, and then would be bumped into the street here where we're relining this curb to account for that extra width. So just to make sure that's clear for everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And then if we look at Rusk Avenue, I noticed that this path will cross some driveways there, specifically one that goes into that one right there, where you have your mouse. So will those crossings through like bigger driveways to the whole area is it planned to be highlighted, painted differently, or using any kind of signage, considering there's a big volume of cars going through that there, because there's a considerable amount of units there, dwelling units.
Yeah, great question, great point. So one thing I failed to mention too with this is and with visibility of the users here, we're planning on lighting the path with path lighting, downward facing path lighting, and the entrances to the driveways will have more. Now that there will be curb there, they'll have driveway aprons for delineating kind of that space and helping create that transition to the properties on the other side of the right of way. With that, I think we can definitely look into the markings here for these. We're going to be including, striping for our continental sidewalks, and making sure that that's clear for users that way. But I think, if especially for some of these larger generators, we could potentially look into using green markings and such to mark that. I'd have to look at some examples to see what we've done in the past on other projects, but I think that's a good idea.
And I guess that would apply to the driveway on Badger, on West Badger too, right? To that big one.
Yep.
There's a couple driveways, one there and one west.
Yep. I think that's definitely something that we can look into and apply.
Awesome. And just to confirm here, is our policy of clearing, talking about snow removal specifically, clearing all the shared use paths, are all shared use paths part of that list of being cleared for snow removal, separated for commuters, or is this just applied to the main commuters within going to downtown? How does that work, Renee? If you could remind me.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So we basically have kind of a tiered system. So we have our primary system. So that's more like the Capital City Path, the Southwest Path, Cannonball, that are cleared before 8 a.m. Whereas we also then have a secondary tier, and this would go into the secondary tier where that's cleared more on like a typical sidewalk where it's once the snow stops. So it would depend a little bit on when that happens. Right now, we don't have capacity to add any more primary paths without removing some. So once this is fully built out, that's something that we could look at. But as it's just this first phase, we would anticipate it going into that second tier phase where it is cleared once the snow is stopped.
Second tier. Okay, cool. Thank you. And then if you go past, go a little bit more north, and you see those two private driveways for the homes that are there on the shared path, are we here saying that those private homeowners won't have to take care of that sidewalk? Then this whole shared path will be taken care of by the city in the second tier?
That is correct. So where it's a shared use path, then the homeowners are not responsible for the clearing. Whereas the sidewalk that's added on the car dealership side, it's a typical 5-foot sidewalk that car dealership would be responsible for clearing that. So the city does take care of shared use paths, all the clearing of those.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I guess my last question would be to maybe, this, as I said at the beginning, is a very exciting project, at least for me, that I live in the South Side and, kind of representing this area in a way. So, Renee, would you mind sharing a little bit, maybe these are just initial thoughts on all of it, but a little bit of how this part will connect, west, north, and when you talked about connecting to Rimrock, will that also be at a curve level on Rusk and Badger, or how are things are being thought at this point?
Yeah, so going to the west, it's intended to be a very similar project. Or going to the east, that's the next phase that we have secured funding for. It's not, unfortunately, there is a little gap before we'll have that funding. But the idea is to bump out the curb in a very similar way and create a shared use path that would match what you see in this drawing. And that would go all the way to Rimrock Road. Now, the Rimrock Road project is a Dane County project that they have funding for, but they are planning as well to put a shared use path that would then connect you up to the Cap City path. So then going to the west, we're still working on kind of that, the crossing of Park Street being a much more tricky endeavor. There's also a bridge that is quite narrow right after this. So that is a much larger project that I would say is still more in the concept phase. We have not applied for funding yet to do that, but it's very much on our radar to complete that full length, especially with the discussions around the potential to have a path along Park Street. We would definitely need to make that connection in the long run. But we would envision the whole thing being kind of your traditional 10-foot path raised at more the sidewalk level, potentially with more bumping out of the curb to narrow the overall Badger Road.
Awesome. Thanks, Renee. So then, if I understand right, in that corner of North Rusk and East Rusk, where the auto dealer is, that corner that we are rebuilding right now as part of this plan, that one would need to be reconstructed again to kind of connect correctly with the 10-foot path extension going to Rimrock?
I think Reed can talk about that a little bit more, but we've been attempting to build it so that when that project starts up, we would not have to do a lot of work at that corner. But Reed, you can talk about that more. You've actually done the work.
Thanks, Renee. Yeah, so we're kind of still looking at this corner. I have some, essentially, what we're trying to do here is continue this 26-foot cross section as we go to the east there. And with that, so there's an existing bus pullout that's located right here that we're kind of going up and around that was installed. So this would be done probably with the next project. But there'd be a transition more or less, from this intersection to come down here. Right now, I just have it kind of shown in going into the existing radius here. But it is something that I have preliminary laid out. We might need to have a little bit of a taper here, and it won't be the exact transition that would probably be once we go further east. But yes, we would like to set this up to reduce the amount of rework needed to be able to fit that path in. Right now, this dealership has, I can kind of show you. So here's Google Maps, excuse me. So orient here, you can kind of see there's some like lights and bollards, and it's kind of on a little hill here. So again, we're kind of limited in this space where we can work in this area. So we're more or less going to be following again, probably the back of the sidewalk to tie in with this new path going east. And more or less, this would probably then require the curb to be bumped out here a little bit more into the streets, and then temporarily have a transition to go back into the unrealigned curb and gutter as it is now. So definitely what we're still kind of putting in design for this part of the project.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind going back to that Google Earth
oh, sure. Yep.
perspective and rotating 180 so we see westbound? So cool. So what I'm seeing here is that all there and also on the other corner there are ramps present at the moment. Just making sure here that we're accounting for all ages and abilities. In the plan that you're showing, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not seeing any ramps that are present.
So we will be installing ADA ramps with the project. This is so what we kind of want to do here is install like a raised crossing or a full raised crossing to elevate the user crossing here to give them more priority. I don't have this completely designed yet, so sorry, I don't have it shown, but yes, no the idea is to have, a traditional, more or less, kind of either more or less raised crossing here to continue the flow of of the path through as you go to the east. So there will be the ability for people to cross the street here. It's just exactly not shown right now.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem about that. Yeah, I guess I was over focusing on the image and not looking at the words. But I love that idea of the race crossing. I mean, the fact that will show people that that's a neighborhood area. You know, there's that residential area that you're entering to kind of give the right sign of, you know, slowing down and being aware of that. So I really like that. Renee, I didn't hear you mentioning anything about going north. Are we assuming just past this project going north, the Rusk Avenue is just, you know, small enough of a volume of vehicles that we just will assume a transition to the street for people rolling on this shared path, and people walking will transition to the sidewalk? That's kind of the plan there.
It is. That street was reconstructed not that long ago. And so we are not planning currently to do it again to extend the path. It does also, the volumes drop off quite a bit after the mobile home park, which is much more high density. And then, of course, there's much more traffic in and out of the car dealership, but it is not going typically into the neighborhood. As Pepe probably knows, this is where there is kind of a constricted opening as you go up the street towards the park and into Bram Street. So it is pretty low volume. You know, obviously we would monitor that for other improvements that it might need in the future if things change. But at this point, we are not looking to redo that street again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Are we planning on adding some signage there for the transition? Any painting signage or something, or maybe even doing some like bicycle markings / bike boulevard situation where we, you know, call to attention people driving there that people using, you know, rolling in any of modes will be potentially going from the path to the street there. I'm particularly aware of this area because I was part of the neighborhood, you know, the NRT neighborhood resource team for a couple of years in that area, and I remember when that street got reconstructed, the perception of speed of the neighbors was something that they mentioned, because in the past the amount of potholes that were present in that street was kind of helping people slow down, but after the reconstruction there was a perception of people speeding or going faster through there. So just want to raise that to your all awareness.
Yeah, we haven't done the signing and marking plan, but we have been talking a little bit about marking that transition. And I think, you know, once we have this, it is kind of a natural bike boulevard as you go north and south. This is like really intended to be part of a really good connection. So I think we would do that kind of outside of this project, probably through Safe Streets, do some things on the connecting streets as well.
Awesome. We're looking forward to seeing that on the Safe Street side. Thanks so much, Reed and Renee, for all your answers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pepe. Yeah, lots of exciting things happening here. Bill, go ahead.
Thanks, Ann. This is a question, I guess, geared more toward Renee. And this is the first time I've heard the term that you have primary and what was the intermediate or secondary?
Secondary, yeah.
Secondary shared paths, and I think that's fine, and I think it's good. But do we have these laid out in a plan or on a map to show where the primaries are and where the secondaries are, or is that something that's still early in the? Because we've only built a few of these shared use paths, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Actually, we don't have a public facing map at this point in time, but Parks, Streets, and Engineering have a map.
Okay.
They have a map to help their staff know kind of where they're supposed to be at what time and to try to not miss things. So that is something, though, that we've been discussing now that we're building so many more. Just to help people understand better. And for route planning, we have been talking about how we can make that a public facing map in the future.
Yeah, when you like, I want to get around back to Hammersley, because I was promoting that and trying to, you know, work with those neighbors to say that this is, I think, is I'll call it a good deal, best solution to the problem of speed and so forth. So to get more of these shared use paths constructed, and I think we're going to see more of these in the future, and I hope we will. But have you gotten any feedback from the folks on Hammersley as far as were they satisfied with the level of maintenance of snow removal for after that first winter? Any concerns, or
Yeah.
not that necessarily they're saying thank you or anything like that, but no complaints, I guess, or what?
I mean, I think everyone would like to have their path be a primary path, right? Like, I think, obviously the people who live right there appreciate that they're not having to
Right.
clear it, obviously. And it is being cleared kind of on the same timeline as any kind of neighborhood sidewalk. But, we do hear
Yeah,
from people
okay.
who would like to see more streets added to our primary network. But I think,
I'm not sure that everybody does want to have theirs on as a primary, but and that's, they're not necessarily the ones that are going to be commuting with their bikes to downtown or someplace like that. But as we build more of these types of shared use paths, I think that's important that be conveyed, the expectations to the project when it's when you go out and have your neighborhood meetings with these folks as to what kind of path it is, and that it's considered to be a secondary, and that what level of maintenance that the timing will be done as far as snow removal. So, I'm pleased with it. I think these are good projects, and I think they're going to be very useful, and we'll see more of these in the future. So, and I agree, not everybody can have a primary, as far as they should not have that expectation, I guess, is what I'm saying. We can't oversell it, but on the other hand, we want to be upfront and transparent about what the maintenance is going to be. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Alder Harrington McKinney, go ahead.
Thank you. Great discussion. And I absolutely am going to be looking for more information about the primary and secondary pathways in that Hammersley area is in District 20. So I do want to make sure that with the neighborhood associations, I get answer to that question, because it came up whether they were satisfied. And so that's a good way of discussing and bringing the neighborhood associations within that conversation. So I do appreciate the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alder. Other comments or questions for Rita Renee? Okay, thanks so much. Exciting project.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, next we have the reports from other BCCs. Anybody have anything to bring forward as an update? Chris?
Yeah, Robbie mentioned this briefly, but Plan Commission had a meeting on curb management, and the city's trying to get a sizable grant to work on that over the next year or two. So,
yeah, we look forward to hearing more about that. Sadly, I was not able to attend because I had a conflict. Robbie, go ahead. Thanks, Chris, for the update.
The Joint Campus Area Committee will meet tomorrow, but last night the UW had a meeting on whether to pave and light the Howard Timmon path along the lake, which I believe I don't remember if I've mentioned that before, but it has come up on our agenda. And since that's a pretty important transportation corridor, although it's not in the city of Madison, it does connect to all kinds of Madison things. That'll probably be something that we'll want to keep an eye on. They had a meeting last night, which I was not able to go to, but it was basically to collect information. Perhaps I will find out more next week when Joint Campus Area Committee meets. That's it.
Thanks, Robbie. Alder Harrington McKinney, go ahead.
Yes, the new executive director of the MPO, we're having coffee on Monday, and so we'll get a chance to introduce ourselves. We've had some communication challenges, so he's going to share what his vision is, and also just as an update, and I'll certainly report back on that following that meeting. So I'm really excited about, meeting him personally and having that one-on-one conversation.
Great, thanks, Alder. Other comments from other BCCs? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Announcements from the chair. We had that appeal subcommittee on a taxi cab license denial and had a challenging time getting our appeal subcommittee together, but we do have a meeting set for July 29th. Denise and Bill are going to join me on the appeal subcommittee. So we'll report back at the next TC the results of that. I don't have any other announcements. Does staff have any other announcements? No? Okay. In terms of future agenda items, we had several referrals from the Common Council to our July 31st meeting. And two of them, well, we already knew because Metro Transit has been publicizing it. We have a public hearing on the new service to Monona and the service equity analysis regarding that. So that's been on our calendar for a while. But at the July 31st meeting, we're going to hear about the ordinance change and the resolution with regard to the Northeast area plan, and also the ordinance and the resolution with regard to the West area plan. And, we had an extensive discussion about the West area plan last time around, and every time, each of these conversations about the area plans is certainly substantial as it should be. So I'm viewing that as a fairly lengthy meeting. So as a result, at the last meeting, there was a motion to refer the approval of the TC annual work plan to the July 31st meeting. And with these other lengthy items, I would entertain a motion to move the approval of the TC annual work plan to a later meeting, just because we want to be fresh for that discussion. Robbie?
So moved.
Okay, there's a motion. Chris?
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second to move the approval of the TC annual work plan to a later meeting. Likely it would be the first meeting in September. But if we could just leave it, the approval to a later meeting, that gives us a little bit of flexibility. So I'm going to assume, is there any discussion with regard to the motion first? Okay, I'm going to assume a unanimous consent vote unless anybody wishes to vote no or abstain. Okay, I'm seeing no hands. So just plan on that being a longer meeting because there will be some substantial discussions in all of those areas. Also, we've got a lot of other items from TC members with suggestions, and we're working on how we can incorporate those into future agenda items. And I'm doing some work on them, some of them offline as well, with staff to figure out how to bring the information forward. Anybody have any other future agenda items that you would like added? Bill?
Thanks, Ann. I didn't have the 31st of July on my calendar, but I free and I just added it. So I guess I didn't realize that He must have.
Yeah, Aiden, can you take a look at the placeholder invitations just to make sure that everybody is on there? And certainly, as we talked about, the folks who were whose appointments came up on June 30th, there's an automatic 90-day extension. Well, I mean, I just saw some that went to the Common Council for April appointments, so they have a little bit of leeway in there. So Aiden can maybe take.
Yeah, we are also, but I do have a August 14th meeting. Is that correct?
Right, and we'll see about that because there's a lot going on in August.
All right.
So we'll see if we will have a meeting, but can other folks check and see if I thought I had it on there. I'll just double check quick.
I have the placeholder on my calendar for the 31st.
Okay, I must have missed it. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have it on mine as well too, Bill.
Okay.
So,
all right, no problem.
But Aiden
No
can
problem.
send it to you. Aiden can
No,
send it
it's
to
not
you
necessary.
again.
I have it now. It's all right.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
All right.
I know that I know I was one of those that had some questions about a work plan, but if we move it to the September 4th, I know I'm going to be gone for that meeting. So, yeah, that's all right. That's all right. Can't make them all.
Okay. You are going to be gone for
I
September
know I
4th,
will
Bill?
be gone September 4th. Yeah.
Well, I might be gone for August 14th if we end up having a meeting. So, since I've been working on it and presenting it, I didn't want it to come then. So,
Yeah.
we'll figure it out.
Okay.
We
Not a
do
problem.
have, as I look forward, September 4th, we are looking at potentially, the Metro Transit financial audit review, Complete Green Streets, B-Cycle. So there already are a number of things on there. So we may end up pushing the work plan to that middle of September, Bill.
That's fine.
If we end,
That'll work.
because Complete Green Streets will be a significant discussion. Okay. Any other comments on future agenda topics? Okay, we need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right, Alder Harrington McKinney. Robbie, is that a second? Okay, I'm going to assume a unanimous consent vote. And thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time.